Hi, my name is Kirsten Burkhog. I teach at Hope College in Holland, Michigan, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why you should read Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia. So, broadly speaking, I am a student of the American founding, and Thomas Jefferson is maybe the quintessential founder. And to some extent, it becomes necessary when one is in grad school to read much of what Jefferson wrote in order to understand him as well as possible. So I read this book in grad school because I had to in order to write about what Jefferson himself was saying. Like, what does Jefferson say? You actually have to read what he says in order to know. So Jefferson is often considered one of the major theoretical guiding lights of the founding generation, especially on the subject of liberty. In general, sometimes we think and talk about Jefferson as something kind of close to an Enlightenment era philosophe. Like, he's someone who is thinking really seriously about these profound philosophical concepts, and he is, definitely. But the difference between Jefferson and someone like a David Hume or an Adam Smith, a John Locke or a Jean-Jacques Rousseau, is that Jefferson actually never wrote a treatise. He never wrote a front-to-back systematic organization of his philosophy or of his thoughts. There's no accounting of his theories that is like complete start to finish. So when we want to get at Jefferson's theories and his theoretical bases, what we end up having to do is read a little bit between the lines. And that means reading all the lines, even the ones that might not seem poised to furnish exactly the things that we're looking for. And such is often the case when we think about the Notes on the State of Virginia. Notes on the State of Virginia was published in 1785. It is Thomas Jefferson's only full-length book that he ever wrote, and it's kind of like a travel guide on Virginia. And in some respects, this is like really fitting. Jefferson is a Virginian. When Jefferson eventually dies, he wants 3 things written on his gravestone, and 2 of those things concern Virginia, which are that he is the author of the Virginia Statutes of Religious Freedom, and he is the founder of UVA. So this book arises from Jefferson's responses to some questions about the state of Virginia that were posed in 1780 by Francois Barbé de Mabois, who was the secretary of the French delegation to Philadelphia. He had questions about all 13 of the states, but Jefferson, of course, undertook specifically only to write about Virginia. And he begins with the kind of geographical, topological, geological, and environmental truths and realities of Virginia. And in some ways, when you read this, the early chapters of Notes on the State of Virginia seem to mirror in some ways or to prelude the early chapters of Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. There's a lot to sort of connect a symmetry between the two. Of course, Democracy in America would be written much later, but eventually throughout the course of Notes on the State of Virginia, Jefferson quickly starts to talk about his politics, his philosophy, his observances of life in Virginia, its politics, its societies, etc. And he really did view Virginia as a model for American politics and society. So when he writes about these sorts of things, they're important. We ought to take him really seriously on this. And there are some moments where Notes on the State of Virginia starts to feel almost like a stream of consciousness in some ways. And out of these streams of consciousness, we get, on the one hand, some of Jefferson's like most beautiful odes to the place that he so obviously loved the most in the world, and to the country that he served faithfully. And it's also where we get some of the ugliest and strangest writing that Jefferson ever recorded, especially about the subject of race. So this is where I get to talk about the fact that Jefferson is usually considered, if not always considered, a gray figure in American political history. And this is largely because of the profound question that is raised between what we modern day Americans recognize as the gap between his theoretical convictions about things like liberty and his practice in life. And I think this can really easily be summed up by this, kind of common articulation that the writer of the Declaration of Independence held slaves, right? And that the author of All Men Are Created Equal was the chief theorist of American liberty, had as many as 6 children that he never acknowledged, whom he kept enslaved, and never manumitted their mother, Sally Hemings. And nowhere is this really profound tension in Jefferson more clear than in Query 14 in Notes on the State of Virginia, where just pages apart, Jefferson is acknowledging completely that the institution of slavery is wrong, juxtaposed to his convictions about liberty, and that it should be planned for legal dissolution. And then just a couple of pages later, he's saying some of the most distasteful things ever penned by an American founder about Black Americans, including this really unfair passage about the American poet Phyllis Wheatley, about whom I talk about more in another video. So then I guess, why this book? Why should we read the Notes on the State of Virginia? I think this book gives us a snapshot of Jefferson as a man and as a thinker, and it allows us in a really profound way to consider him in his depth and in his complexity. This is a text that defies our desire to flatten Jefferson into whatever mold or shape will best suit us. So among the founders, there is always sort of this impulse to sort of flatten and to say, well, the founders say, or the founders believed, or the founders made it such. And I think this impulse is perhaps most pertinent in Jefferson, but the problem is that Jefferson is almost more accurately remembered not as a person who gives us clear-cut evidence for our political predispositions, but instead just purely as a man of twists and turns. He is a man of juxtapositions. He is a man of paradoxes, of complexities, of difficult to reconcile tensions. And by rights, we ought to be able to actually think about him in those sorts of ways. And I think reading a text like Notes on the State of Virginia actually begins to illuminate why Jefferson remains so evasive to us in this way, because it is the most of Jefferson we ever get at once. So it gives us some access into his thinking in ways that none of his other writings, with the exception perhaps of his letters, do. So when we probe more deeply into some of these really objectionable comments that Jefferson is making, and specifically his critique of Phyllis Wheatley in Query 14, it actually helps us better understand this thing that I've termed the Jeffersonian gap, right? This distance between Jefferson's theories of liberty and his practice of slaveholding, not just slaveholding, but profession of some really ugly racial anthropologies. Why this man who could so clearly see slavery's inhumanity and incompatibility with liberty was also able to perpetuate this institution in practice in so many various and different ways. Notes on the State of Virginia gives us access first and foremost to Jefferson's kind of bad racial anthropology, which was at the time in some European circles a cutting edge anthropological science. And Jefferson, of course, more than any of the other founders, was inspired by and believed in the empiricism of the Enlightenment and eschewed much metaphysical examination for the sake of observable, quantifiable data. And additional evidence for this might also include the Bible that Jefferson owned, from which he excised all evidence of miracles but kept all moral teachings intact. And what this amounts to is that for Jefferson, liberty wasn't really a metaphysical concept. It's an anthropological fact. Liberty is owed to humans because of what humans are as creatures, not because of some sort of special or ineffable quality of Americans, which is why he has to attest, and consistently does attest, that Black Americans, being human, do in fact deserve liberty. Liberty, comparatively, for someone like Phyllis Wheatley, he's condemning on such uncertain, or on no uncertain terms, views liberty as a more metaphysical and religious concept, something that Jefferson takes particular aim at with her. He says she's too religious. And he chalks this up actually to a kind of gross racial stereotype about her ability to reason, which could not be more evidently false for any of those who have actually read any of Wheatley's writings. So reading Wheatley, as I suggest that you do in another video, helps us contextualize this, right? She's got this metaphysical view of liberty that makes emancipation this urgent, desperate need, and not something that we can relegate to a far-flung future, which Jefferson repeatedly does by scientifying the Black right to liberty and calling emancipation an inevitability, a scientific one nonetheless. So Wheatley challenges Jefferson on the very point where it seems like Jefferson has an obvious monopoly on American thought, which is liberty itself. So I think one of the greatest mistakes that we as Americans can make in civic life is to allow the story of our national origins to be simple. In the same way that the founding myths of Romulus and Remus or Aeneas and the Trojans told ancient Romans something about what it means to be a Roman, the way we remember our founding tells us something about what it means to be Americans. And too often, the narratives of our founding are compressed and oversimplified and made the tools of those who desire to use the founders for their own purposes. American citizens can avoid this by reading for ourselves what the great men and women of our past have to say about that past, and moreover, what they have to say about themselves. We can carefully examine these individuals not by their worst efforts or even by their best, but as the kind of full, complicated, fallen, and nuanced people they were, who nonetheless shaped the world in which we live and in which we still find ourselves. So I think you should read Notes on the State of Virginia, because I don't think that you should let anyone with some kind of axe to grind tell you who Jefferson was. I think you should let Jefferson tell you who Jefferson was. So read the Notes on the State of Virginia.